alaikum. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Out of Sight podcast. Today we are welcomed by Dr. Yasmin Al-Asadi, a child and adolescent psychiatrist who works with children with various disabilities. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Yasmin.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Alhamdulillah. I just wanted to get straight into your background story, your childhood, your background, everything. For me, it's so fascinating hearing the stories of when people were kids and how they connected back to where they are today.
You sound like a psychiatrist. It sounds a bit cliche, but I've just always wanted to be a doctor. Various kind of early life experiences led me thinking that I wanted to go into cancer research. I was fascinated by kind of what people's experience of that illness is and the image it has and the stories we hear. And then I kind of carried on going through school, and
So was this cancer research even as you were little?
Oh yeah, I was a little geek. I had my briefcase. I was set on this scientific path.
Amazing.
I was a bit of a geek. But then I got to sixth form, and I was studying A-level psychology. And I was mesmerized by what I was learning. We were learning about classical experiments, about kind of in-groups and out-groups, about our relationships to obedience and authority, and I did a bit of forensic psychology as well, understanding why people commit crimes, and linking that to their early life experiences. So I was just blown away, I think also because for so long I'd heard about kind of the effects of dictatorship in Iraq. It shaped our life, it shaped our migration to the UK, and I was intrigued to read and learn about these studies that demonstrated that good people can still do bad things. None of us are immune, and I was really intrigued by the experiences that led people to do those things. And then I kind of went to med school and did a bit more learning, and then went into the world of work, and I did both jobs. And actually I just gravitated towards people. Psychiatry is about connection, it's about compassion, it's about care, it's about trust, and ultimately I just enjoy sitting in a room and really just getting to know someone beyond their illness, beyond their label, beyond their diagnosis.
It's interesting you brought up Iraq, and I feel like that's something all Iraqis share, right? You can't be introduced to an Iraqi without their trauma coming up or without their experiences. For me, I haven't lived in Iraq, but still growing up, hearing all those stories, I grew up similar to that, where it's like, I just want to help people. I just want to be able to help, even though it wasn't my story, but it shapes us as children growing up, everything.
We were never really meant, it wasn't a planned migration, not many are, but my father was supposed to be coming on his own. He had an opportunity here, and there were kind of rumblings that things weren't quite right, and it was a bit risky for my mum, who was pregnant at the time with my sister, it was just risky. There was kind of, when things don't seem quite right. So within a few weeks, they got everything together, they upped and left. And then a month or so later, the Gulf War started, and the rest is history. And so kind of having that story growing up, I always felt like we escaped by the skin of our teeth, and that we were spared this suffering that sadly so many people had to endure, and that felt like a huge responsibility, that I had to do something with that. And medicine was the answer to that.
It's a bit like survivor's guilt, isn't it? Knowing that you were able to escape something by chance, right? Something that's affected so many other people for so many years. Do you think that's had a part in what made you?
Some psychotherapists might call it sublimation, which is where we deal with uncomfortable feelings and we put them into an output that feels more appropriate. So similar that you might find people who experience something with an illness, and actually they go on to work in a charity in that area, or they go on fundraising for things related to that illness. It's taking that uncomfortable experience and turning it into something purposeful, turns something difficult into something useful, something helpful.
It's interesting you say that. I think sometimes people go through that unconsciously. You don't even realize the guilt or the negative feeling you have towards something, and because we don't spend too much time analyzing exactly what's going on, we just try and find ways to comfort us.
For sure.
And subhanallah, it turns out to be something that's so connected, but sometimes we don't even realize until we look back at it. So what happened after you went to uni?
I did a lot of work. I worked in both areas, and as I said, I just connected. And then I thought about, so the idea of kind of, as I said, the migration and this opportunity, I wanted to work with children. I wanted to work with children with trauma initially, and kind of thinking about conflict and war, but you go through jobs and you meet people and you have life experiences that now, a number of years later, I won't go into the number of years, I've found myself in a team working with children with disabilities. I play with a lot of Lego. I do a lot of colouring in, and yeah,
The best game there is, isn't it? Lego just never gets boring.
For sure.
How do you find your work?
I love my job. I talk about my job a bit too much. But it was interesting, as I was talking to some colleagues about this podcast, one of them said, make sure you talk about the stigma against psychiatrists. And I was like, okay, it's not about me, but we'll touch on it. Because when I decided I wanted to do psychiatry, it wasn't something that was welcomed with open arms by a lot of people. There were concerns, and people, when they're concerned, they can express themselves in certain ways. And I got a lot of comments like, you're going to end up depressed, like your patients. Somebody told a family member that psychiatrists are crazier than their patients, don't let her do this. There was the
You're going to need your own psychiatrist to deal with everything.
There was the one, the wonderful one of nobody's going to want to marry you. That was also thrown in the mix. And then there were the people who were trying to help. They said, okay, no, I understand you're interested in early life experiences and you want to do this. Why don't you be a pediatrician? Or why don't you go into general practice? And there was this real kind of resistance to going to psychiatry. And I was convinced. I was interested by the science of it. I was interested by the day-to-day. I wanted to go to work. I wanted to see these patients, young and old at the time. And I landed in it.
You're making it sound very easy, but in reality, I think even if you have your mind set on something, when you're faced with, for lack of a better word right now, backlash from your community or your family and your friends towards it, it makes a lot of people think twice about this. What made you think, no, I'm going to ignore all these comments and I'm going to stick to what I know I want to do?
Firstly, rightly so. It's important to hear people's comments. So it's not as if I kind of said to everybody, go away, I'm doing what I'm doing. It's important to understand why people are concerned and to think about it. And the more I've progressed within psychiatry, the more I've come to understand it, and hopefully we can talk a bit about that some more. But I enjoyed what I was doing. I felt that there was a need, in particular, as has been mentioned in a couple of previous episodes, there was a need for a Muslim woman to be in this field. And I had conviction in what I was doing, and I hope I had the right intentions. And also, to be honest, I could have left at any time. People change career all the time. So I didn't see it as a lifelong kind of, this is it, and I have to stick with it even if I hate it. And sadly, the state of the NHS at the moment, a lot of people are changing career, but thankfully, I'm still here.
For you yourself, you didn't end up hating it?
Not yet. No, not yet. We'll see. Politics is a whole other thing, and politics impacts health, and again, that's something we'll touch on later. But I loved it. But also, that was at the beginning, but during the early years of training, one of the most important things within junior psychiatry training is something called a balance group, a reflective group, where we kind of collect with our peers within our training programs, and we discuss, we reflect, and we discuss complex cases that make us feel a certain way, or where we might kind of behaved in a way that you think, actually, why did I make that decision, or why did I react in that way? And you sit and understand yourself. There's a concept in psychotherapy that's really important within reflection, but also in relationships in general. It's called transference and countertransference. So transference is when the patient transfers their feelings onto the doctor or the therapist, their feelings from early childhood, positions they may have been put in when they were younger, suddenly they find themselves feeling that way again, and they transfer those feelings onto the therapist. And the therapist then has a counter-transference, which is their response to those feelings, again shaped by their early life experiences, their training, and so on. And of course, not just between doctors and patients, that happens in all relationships. And so sitting in that group and reflecting for many years and once a week, every week for a long time, I came to understand me as a person, what my values are, what my prejudices are, where my biases sit, and I was kind of attuned to understanding other people's as well. And it was really difficult because I'd be spending hours with these patients in crisis in A&E at 3 o'clock in the morning, hearing their kind of deepest, darkest feelings, their hopes and their fears. And sometimes, I had clinicians who were negating that, who were criticizing that, who were judging people, who were accusing them of lying, who were accusing them of attention seeking. It's important to say that the majority of interactions were wonderful, full of professionalism and compassion, but ultimately we're all human and we have these biases. And so I found myself really kind of fighting and feeling like I had to be not in a battle position, but I had to advocate for my patients. Because my values around injustice and advocacy. And
I imagine those group sessions were very helpful because for me, I feel sometimes someone tells me something or I hear a story and like you said, makes me feel a certain way. But unless I spend time dissecting why I feel that certain way.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm just left uneasy.
Totally.
But with the time, and I'm guessing with the support and the people around you to give you that platform for you to voice why you feel this way or how it had an effect, it gives you the opportunity to learn exactly why different things are triggering to you, which otherwise you might just realize, okay, I'm upset, but you wouldn't know why.
And it's important that it's a safe place, because sometimes we have negative reactions to people. And it's important to acknowledge why that feeling arises and what we can do to stop ourselves from acting out in a negative way. We're all going to be triggered by things. We're all going to be angered by things. But how do we respond to that? And I think that's why it's important to think about how those biases then lead into how we stigmatize people and how we react to stigma, or how we perpetuate stigma, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that those things are, available, because I think, if anything, it's needed for everyone, not just psychiatrists. And there's so many other jobs that you see people who do interact with people on a personal level. Or like you said, it's not even the doctor-patient relationship, it's with anyone. But without that platform, sometimes teaching you how to think, or just asking you the right questions to be able to think a certain way, we're all kind of in a bubble of, I feel this, and that's it. But we need to understand why we feel it to be able to move on. So going back to, your placements and stuff, then you ended up in CAMHS.
Oh, I chose CAMHS.
You chose CAMHS, you didn't end up, you chose it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed working with children, and there was obviously a lot of potential for change, and I'm interested in, as I said, psychotherapy, but also the medical model, and CAMHS was a nice mix of the two.
Should we just clarify what CAMHS is?
Child and adolescent mental health. So working with children from 0 through to 18 in various different domains. So we work with crisis. I'm currently working with disability. And yeah, it's fun, hard work, but fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm imagining the hard work is more than the fun, but it's very needed.
The bit with the patients, not work at all. Genuinely just fun. The reports, the admin, the
a lot of paperwork,
that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So going back
like
to the stigma
assistant.
that you brought up, because you did say some not even clinicians, sometimes people's attitudes are not in the most positive. Was your experience, what was this based on? Why were some people reacting like this?
So obviously everybody will have their individual narratives about kind of how their experience is shaped. I just, it's funny how certain experiences in your training or in your youth can shape the way you think. And I distinctly remember reading a paper. We have to always present like journals at a journal club. And I found this journal because I was interested in CAMHS about adolescents presenting to A&E in crisis when they'd self-harmed or if they were feeling suicidal or anything like that. And it was fascinating to read about these kids' experiences of, let's not forget also, these are kids seeking help from adults, which is a dynamic in itself. But it was interesting to hear their perspective and how they felt judged. Sometimes they felt a lack of compassion, they felt blamed. And a lot of them then didn't come back as a result of that.
Back to A&E?
Yeah, they said that if they were to find themselves in crisis again, they wouldn't come back.
Based on their experience of how they were dealt with.
Or maybe the consequences of what happened when they come. So it blew me away. And, I've spent a lot of hours on call and going into A&Es and seeing people, accident and emergency, seeing people in crisis. And I'm always reminded of that paper because we have an opportunity with they say make every therapeutic engagement count. And I have an opportunity every time I see a young person to validate their feelings, to understand where they're coming from, and to hopefully give them a positive experience of seeking help and being understood.
I know you had it in you sorry to interrupt, but I know you had it in you from the very beginning to want to help people and things, but that ability to be able to be so empathetic, to be able to validate people's feelings, do you think this was something natural within you, or is this something you've actually worked hard to develop, the talent?
I think it's training. I think that obviously certain people are drawn towards medicine, certain people are drawn towards psychiatry, but we're trained probably because we understand as well. There's a lot of fear, and I think that's kind of where stigma comes from, to be honest, in my mind. If we and maybe it's helpful to think about. I think language is important. Semantics are really important to understand, and we think, where does the word stigma come from? Okay, so the earliest reference I could find was around the 1500s, a Latin reference, where it's the idea of branding something with a hot iron, right? So, and in Greek, I think it was using a pointed instrument to mark something. And then later on in the 60s, so fast forward a few centuries, there was a Canadian sociologist called Erving Goffman who wrote a paper about stigma, and he defined it, let's not do injustice to his definition, it's a situation of the individual who is disqualified from full social acceptance. He talked about the fact that there were significant shifts in the kinds of disgrace that aroused concern, and that stigma has now morphed, this is in the 60s, into an issue of both identity and opportunity. So understanding disgrace, difference, social acceptance, and then moving into identity. And then in the early 2000s, there was more sociological research that looked at stigma as a fundamental social process, how it organizes society, how power is played out in society as a result of stigma. And if we think about going back to the Latin definition of branding cattle, what's the purpose of branding cattle? You're marking your herd, you're marking your cows, you're knowing which is going to go where, you're organizing it, you're controlling it. And so in 2001, this study by Lincoln Phelan, or this paper rather, they talked about 4 processes that stigma uses to work its magic, or not magic for want of a better word. So first you label human differences, or we as a society label human differences. And then we stereotype those differences. And then we separate those labeled from us, the big us. And then there's a loss of status, and there's discrimination against that labeled group. So say, for example, I was going to notice a difference between us. You're wearing a plain hijab, I'm wearing a patterned hijab. I decide that people, this is for the purposes of the example, so I'm going to be kind, but people who wear plain hijabs are nicer people. Okay? I don't know why I'm stigmatizing myself. I could have been kinder to me.
Internalization.
So people who wear plain hijabs are nicer people, which inherently makes me not very nice. And then I separate us, because you're plain and I'm patterned. And then actually I lose my status. I'm not as important because you're the host, and you're nice and you're wonderful, and I'm just, I don't know, made a wrong call. And then you discriminate against me because of that labeling. And that's obviously a very simple
I mean, no,
example.
if anything, I was thinking the opposite. The example may have been simple, but I was thinking the opposite of, we use the word stigma so easily in our day-to-day lives. Oh, this is stigmatized, or let's not go by the stigma on this. But the way you've just described it, it's so much deeper than just the surface level of the stigma that we think. Even when we do talk about mental health and we talk about disabilities, and we are often, heard, we often hear mental health is stigmatized. And it's just that sentence. And I don't know how many of us I for sure haven't gone through the history of what does that word even mean, the true depths of what it means to say that something is stigmatized.
I think language is fascinating, and language is essential when we're thinking and talking about disability, which we can come on to later. But, you accidentally somewhat, I've kind of gone on to a point I wanted to talk about later, because we've talked about stigma in the negative. But as I was talking to some friends who live with disabilities, and I used this example, they said to me, well, actually, hang on a minute, you focus on the negative here. What about the unfair advantage? Well, what about the advantage, rather? Because there's a book called The Unfair Advantage, which I'll come on to. But in labeling people, there's also a benefit. In my line of work, where I do autism assessments, there are a lot of people who don't want their child labeled. And my job is to have a strengths-based approach to help understand, well, okay, let's work with your narrative, let's understand what you want, and let's try to find a common ground. This is what I observe as a clinician, this is our assessment, what's going to work for you, how are we going to navigate this? Because in my experience, actually, some children need that label to get what they need in terms of support and resource and so on. And that kind of goes into a much bigger political conversation, which we don't need to bother ourselves with today. But why is stigma important if we're going to stick to the negative for now? Because we're challenging stigma. We're not kind of celebrating it at the moment. As I was listening to episodes along the months, I was struck by how many of the people who came on, people who were living with disability, talked about their fear in sharing their disability with her, especially if it was hidden or being seen. And it made me think a lot about shame, So it's interesting that actually when I was looking through the research, as a psychiatrist or kind of a psychology student formally, we think about the individual, but the bulk of research around stigma came from the sociological world, because we're looking at society, we're looking at kind of organizational principles, systemic principles, and how they shape people's experience of the world around them. We're social beings, ultimately. And so it fascinated me, because a lot of the conversation was about individuals saying people with disabilities should feel capable of talking, of feeling empowered, of coming out, of being seen. And I thought to myself, well, taking a sociological lens, what are we doing as a society, as a community, collectively? What are we doing to create a community where people feel able, where people feel safe, where they're not going to be judged, where they're not going to be discriminated against? Let's take the pressure off the person who's already got enough to deal with and think about what's our responsibility. What are our values? What are our biases? What are we doing?
I think you're 100% right. I've seen this so many times. It's just when someone is questioned, for example, for not knowing how to deal with a specific disability or a specific instance, they're like, but they didn't tell me. Even a comment like that implies that the responsibility of raising awareness is on the person who is going through more than the other people around them. Or something like, this person hadn't told me, or this person should have done this. And sometimes I feel like these comments aren't even said in a negative manner. It's just the instinct of the humans is that it's someone else's responsibility rather than my responsibility, which, I mean, I'm not an Islamic scholar, but from my understanding goes against, the Islamic values that we do have and that we strive towards, instead of focusing on what can I do? What's my duty towards everyone else? We keep expecting the people going through something to educate us without thinking to ourselves, well, hold on a second, maybe I should educate myself. And then along the way, ask for guidance from people, but just put more focus on myself. But I think we're getting there. I feel like there isn't a bit of an improvement.
Listen, we have to celebrate the positives, and of course,
absolutely.
I don't want this to be to come across negative in any way, shape, or form. But it's something that that has been provoked in me as I've kind of been thinking about this over the years. And obviously, you preempted something that we'll talk about a bit later as well, about kind of allyship and advocacy. But a lot of blogs and kind of social media that I've seen from people living with disabilities, that, you know what, I'm tired. You might be the 10th person that's asked me that question today. It's not my job, particularly now in the day and age where there's information that's so readily available. But going back to what you said about not wanting to ask or being afraid to ask, and similar to what I was saying earlier about this nervousness about people coming out, for want of a better word, with their disability, I thought, well, what's going on here? Is it fear? Is it nervousness? Is it awkwardness? Is it not knowing how to speak? And I kind of all bottled down to something that I think is central, which is shame. Shame is something that is so prevalent in our society and so damaging, and probably something that I despise more than anything. And so I thought, okay, semantics are important. Let me think. What is shame? If you look in the dictionary, it's in some places it's defined as a loss of honor. Okay? It's related to feelings of embarrassment and humiliation, sometimes related to doing something. By its very nature, it's often hidden. And when it's hidden, it's allowed to grow. And when it grows, what happens? Sometimes it can become internalized. If felt on a longer-term basis, on a chronic basis, it becomes internalized.
Because there was no one there to question it or make you think elsewise. It's just been in your head.
As with any negative, intrusive thoughts, when we're talking about anxiety or shame, the key to getting better and overcoming that is challenging it and essentially disproving it, because 9 times out of 10, it's probably not going to be correct. And some people say, well, actually, there's a social function of shame. Shame is an organizing principle as well. We need people to feel shame to adhere to laws, to kind of adhere to cultural norms.
Again, perhaps. It's a bit of a control thing, isn't it? Shame can be used to control people.
And sometimes we need, society needs control in some way or another, and we need to kind of recognize the difference between bad and good, and shame can play a part in that. But it becomes a problem when it becomes internalized and becomes central to one's identity. Because what feelings do we associate with shame? We associate things like inadequacy, feeling rejected, not wanting to put yourself out there, not being able to bring your whole self. For a long time I didn't tell people I was a psychiatrist because I had so much backlash. I was like, I don't need that conversation today, I'm just a doctor. And sometimes even I work in the NHS. It was just easier. And then I'm depriving that person of a big part of myself. Some people also might kind of manifest as perfectionists, very anxious. They might feel like an outsider. And when that becomes a part of yourself, it becomes a part of your identity. It affects your self-worth, your self-view, your self-esteem. And if we extrapolate that to living with disability, well, you're obviously going to withdraw into yourself. You're not going to put yourself out there. You're going to miss opportunities that might be really good, because those opportunities focus on what you can do, the things that you do so well. But actually, you've internalized a feeling about yourself where you can't get out there.
And this is, I think, just the shame we're talking about, general shame of anyone. Yeah. But imagine that on a scale of someone who's already living with a disability having that shame.
And then add in ethnic minority, add in class. There are so many kind of differentiators that can impact how we interact with the world. there has been an improvement in the conversation around shame, similar to around disability and around stigma. And one of the people who I listen to most on this subject is someone called Brené Brown. I'm sure lots of people have heard of her. She had a TED Talk in 2012 that blew up and changed her life. And actually she talks very articulately about how that tapped into her feelings of shame. And it was like not supposed to happen. She describes shame as an epidemic. She talks about if you were to try to grow shame in a petri dish, the dish that we put kind of pink stuff in and we grow bacteria in. If you were to want to grow shame, it will need three things to grow. It needs secrecy, it needs silence, and it needs judgment. And if you put one more thing in, it can't grow. If you put empathy in the petri dish, shame cannot grow. Empathy is the antidote to shame. Not sympathy, because there's a big difference. Not pity, not sorrow, not what if, not how can I fix this, not oh, I'm so sorry.
So just before we carry on with this, what's the biggest difference? Like, explain the difference between sympathy and empathy.
Sympathy is feeling sorry for somebody, is recognizing their pain and kind of going, oh, I'm so sorry. Empathy is sharing and understanding in that feeling. So we might have a feeling of nervousness, for example. I can empathize with your nervousness in presenting this show. You might empathize in my nervousness because we're sharing that feeling. You're doing a great job, by the way.
So are you.
So empathy is really kind of walking in someone else's shoes and endeavoring to understand. And it can make waves, honestly, I can't describe.
I want to go back and watch the rest of this TED Talk because I have, you know what, I've seen the TED Talk where it didn't go to plan. I think that's the 2012 one. But the one that she's discussed, you just said, where she analyzes that one, I haven't seen that. So it would be really interesting.
I mean, I'm not a member of the Brené Brown fan club, but, I'll happily, if it's in for education, then by all means. But... Sorry, I was just going to say it's important that we think about empathy because this whole conversation is kind of viewed with the lens of ableism. Yeah, in the same way that race is often discussed within the white lens, or that neurodiversity is discussed within a neurotypical lens, the dominant group sets the pace for the discourse. Yeah, and so what are we doing again to allow people to come out and be seen for who they are, but not kind of see their impairment first and foremost. You look at this picture, not see the wheelchair first, but see actually the person with the heart or the person with the cane, but who are they inside? And it's interesting that this is called out of sight, but actually if you look at most of the disabilities depicted on this logo, and this is when I spoke to somebody in my life who has a disability, she said, do you know, I don't like that. It doesn't represent me. So I thought was really interesting because that didn't come from me. I would look at it and go, oh, it's inclusive, it's interesting, actually, you've got quite a few. But she, as somebody who has a hidden disability, was like, that's not me. And so when we go through this, using this lens, we have to think about, well, what are we bringing out from people? What are we allowing them? Are we creating an environment where people can come out and be truly seen for who they are? Not for what they are, not for what they have, not for what they need, not for what they're not, but who they are. What makes them who they are? What are their values? Are we allowing ourselves to see past what we see on the surface? In the same way that Islamically, I want someone to not look at my hijab and go, kind of stereotype me. Yeah, we're all different, and we all have things to celebrate, and we're all worthy of love in one way or another,
And I think the conversations about this topic have been going on and on and on. But how do you think, what would your advice be to someone who's, for example, listening, or someone who's having these thoughts themselves and thinking to themselves, I want to be more empathetic. I want to, because obviously when we spoke like just a few minutes ago and we're talking about the talent that you have of trying to validate people's feelings and understand them, and you said it came with training. Not everyone has access to that kind of training. So if someone was going to think to themselves, you know what, I'm going to work on myself 5 minutes a day, what would you tell them to do?
To be honest, when I say training, what I mean is actually, what is my training? Doctors are trained on the job. So training is seeing people. Every day, I see people who are experiencing one thing or another, be it disability, be it mental ill health. And every day, I tap into compassion. My job in that room with that patient, with that family, is to try to understand them, try to understand their experience. To be humble and know that actually, people come to me and they call me the expert. I'm not an expert in your life. I say this to families all the time. You're an expert in your child. You're an expert in your experience. I know what I know, but I know a lot about what I don't know. My first kind of foray into the world of disability was at the Paralympics in 2012. I happened to be at university nearby. It was very serendipitous. I kind of applied. I volunteered as a team leader, and it was life-changing, quite frankly. I learnt to enjoy waking up at 5 a.m., which sadly I haven't maintained, but that's a different story. But it was just an incredible experience to be surrounded by a celebration of ability. Oscar Pistorius at the time had said something that you are not disabled by the disabilities that you have. You are able by the abilities that you have. Right? How many of us allow ourselves to see that ability first? And now, the Paralympic legacy is a bit complicated. It's not perfect. You know, there are ongoing issues, but it's done a lot for the conversation around disability. It's done a lot for empowering people. But there was just one niggle that I had when I was there, because the PR campaign around the Paralympics at that time was about people being superhuman, and there was lots of pictures of people with these incredible prostheses, and they were, you know, people had this technology. We now have this amazing tech that makes things accessible for people, for some people. But I found myself thinking, well, what about the person whose entirety of their effort is about getting out of bed in the morning, whose superhuman feat is to do something completely ordinary? In celebrating excellence and success and achievement, who are we leaving behind? Because that's always the question in my mind. Who are we leaving behind?
You know what? I know you're talking about the Paralympics. It's not off topic. It's a bit related. But I feel these are thoughts I have sometimes when it comes to faith and spirituality as well. For, you know, we watch shows and, for example, we may see someone and compare them to our child or to someone, and they read the Quran beautifully, or they've memorized the Quran, or you know, things like that, and you're like, oh wow, and you just think that's the bar and that's the level. But by thinking that, you're kind of excluding the person who, let's say a normal person, okay, that was the wrong word, not normal, but let's say an average person who, for example, Arabic is not their first language and they've put so much effort to learn one surah. Absolutely. Or going with someone who has various disabilities or something that's maybe not allowing them even to concentrate enough to be able to read one. And reading one ayah is such a big achievement, but we don't put light on that. We don't acknowledge it. We don't celebrate it as much. By always celebrating the very big major milestones, I do feel that sometimes we exclude people, even within faith and spirituality. Listen,
it's important to be ambitious, of course, absolutely, and we have to celebrate, but we have to celebrate all of it. We have to create a space where people can be completely of their efforts. I completely...
There is that saying, isn't there? Something like, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, the fish will always think it couldn't. What is it?
If you Along those lines.
If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, I don't remember the rest of it, but basically the fish wouldn't even be thankful or appreciative or acknowledge the fact that it can swim,
for sure,
because he's being judged by something that's not their talent, and that's not a disability or anything. It's just people and being
fit. Yeah. But it's important to be clear here. You know, like for some people, their disability or whatever label they choose to use is invaluable to their identity, you know, and that's fine. One size does not fit all, and it's okay. You know, they might feel invalidated, for example, if I said, I see you as a person. For example, I remember I was on a Zoom call during the pandemic on a big like teaching session, and the person tried to point me out to ask me a question, and they said to me, the person wearing glasses. And I thought to myself, there are much more distinctive characteristics that I have, because there's about 10 other people wearing glasses. You know, my hijab is part of my identity. I don't mind you telling me that, you know, the person wearing the whatever color hijab, but for her, she was trying not to be kind of stereotyping or not to label me. And so it's interesting, you know, we can miss the mark, and that's okay, because as long as we're having a conversation about it, it's fine. So, you know, some people might see their disability as central to their identity. That's their experience. Other people feel invalidated when all you see is their disability. That's their experience.
I think that goes back to, we didn't speak about it, but you did touch on the fact that some people don't want a label. So it's kind of connected back to that as well, because they might think that if there is a label associated with what they're going through, that that's the label that's the lens that everyone, it's going to be the definition for everything.
And it's hard.
Is that why you think people don't want a label, or do you think there's other...
Various reasons. Look, I work with kids, and kids can be mean. You know, and you know, sadly, a lot of my patients experience bullying because of their difficulties, particularly probably because of the difficulties with autism and the social nature of the condition. Kids can be mean. Families cannot understand. It can create kind of shame. It's, you know, in this transactional world that we live in, sadly, we celebrate a lot of success. You know, I talked about our experience of leaving Iraq and kind of what that put in me in terms of wanting to help people in their early life experiences, but always reminds me that we were never starting from a level playing field. you know? And it's funny because we celebrate meritocracy so much. If something good happens, it's our fault. I caused that good thing. Let's not forget the generations of my family and my ancestors and all their struggles and everything they've done. The hard work of my parents, you know, the fact that my parents were university graduates. You know, those things impact us. And so, but in this transactional world, actually, we celebrate, it's a bias. We celebrate the positives as all us.
It's me, yeah.
Yeah, I did it. It was
we
mine.
forget everyone else who helped us get here.
But anything difficult, nothing to do with me. Again, you know, talking about this isn't, I tried to talk to a lot of people that I know who experience disability and get their voices, and I spoke to my friend about this, and she was saying that in this transactional world, it's really hard because then that's how you define success. You define success through, you know, if we think about in our community, educational achievement, financial ability to earn, you know, and marriage, children.
I was just going to say that, again, that's something you touched on at the beginning. I think marriage and the prospect of marriage proposals really affects, you know, negative, not disproportionately for women and children, women and girls,
For sure.
who are going through the same thing as perhaps
You know,
boys are.
She spoke about being partially sighted, that she was encouraged as a child not to disclose anything to anyone for fear of it coming back. And it's interesting when she was meeting people that they would be going great and it would be wonderful, and she felt safe enough to disclose it in the interest of being honest and transparent, and they would run a mile. And, you know, it's important to acknowledge that it's not an easy thing to do. It's important to have a conversation. But it was interesting that, because how she put it was, it just reiterates the shame. You know, there's nothing that you've done to you haven't failed in any way, but she felt like a failure. It really hurt. It reminds me of another story, because when we're talking about Oscar Pistorius, so if we think about his athletic career, so South African Paralympian, he was one of the first athletes, if memory serves, to use prosthetics in a non-para event. So he was running alongside able-bodied athletes, and that was celebrated, and it was kind of the seminal moment in world athletics. And then he started winning races. So then people started asking questions. Well, hang on a minute. Do his blades give him an advantage? He doesn't have legs below the knee. But do his blades give him an advantage? Is this fair? What's going on here? Should we be allowing this? And, you know, professional sport is complicated. There's a lot of money involved, so there's different costs. But I think that's the point. There are costs. Inclusivity has costs. And who is willing to incur that cost? You know, if I have a social responsibility as somebody who is able, what does that mean for my life? You know, am I willing to make those sacrifices? Am I willing to sacrifice is the right word, I think. And perhaps professional athletics is not very relatable, but I'll tell you a story of a friend who's partially sighted, who we were walking. It was a nice sunny day, we were going out for a walk. She had her kid in her hand, I had my daughter in my hand. And then there was like a bottleneck in the path, so she went ahead of me. And, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking. She thankfully was able to confide in me, probably because I was a psychiatrist, hopefully because I'm a decent friend, I hope. So it's been hard for her to kind of process what her visual impairment means, first for her as an individual and then for her as a parent. So she's been on a journey, we've been on a journey. And anyway, so we were walking, and she went up ahead of me, and then this guy, I was kind of watching from behind, this guy cut across her path. I could see trajectories, and she couldn't see. And he cut across her, and he bumped into her, they barred shoulders, and he went ballistic. What's wrong with you? Are you blind? And she was like, to her credit, she was like, actually, yes, I am. I am blind. Thank you very much. And he went, well, why are you going out? And why are you bringing your kid?
Oh, wow.
Like, what are you doing to her? I was furious. Thankfully, she was calm. And just kind of said whatever and moved. Interestingly, she apologized to him and he didn't apologize, which was a conversation in itself. But I was so angry, again, thinking about my biases, about the fact that you have no right to tell her what she can and can't do. She has the right, freedom to walk. Why should she deprive her child of mother-daughter experiences? Like, who are you? But ultimately, there's a cost to his day. And, you know, he may have been going through something. That's on him, that's fine, but there's no excuse to act that way. But that's one of the costs. He had to make a sacrifice. He couldn't be texting on his phone and listening or whatever he was doing because she needed some space and right of way. And so it's a simple cost, but actually these costs are things that we all incur.
It is, and I think, again, obviously education plays a really important role, but these experiences, I think, I'm hoping, ideally, when he reflects on this encounter. He does acknowledge that this wasn't the right way for me to be. But I think in the heat of the moment, sometimes people say things, people do things, and that's why reflection is just so 100%. Important.
It's okay to get things wrong. You know, I've said that a couple of times, and that's part of education. So how do we foster empathy? Okay, because we have this social responsibility, right? So how do we educate ourselves? Well, education is key, number one. We've got to be curious. Okay, we've got to ask. Well, I wonder why that person happened. This guy, he doesn't come to the mosque whenever he tells me he's going to come. What's happened? Is it that the mosque isn't accessible? You know, Brother Naqi was talking about his visual impairment and kind of his experience at Ramadan, which really kind of just hit my heart, because I'm sure there was a very well-meaning person who was trying to help, but they just missed the mark. And sometimes we've got to think, actually, perhaps it's shame on our part that stops us from asking. You know, and only through my experiences, as I said, through work and through friends, that I notice people with disabilities more. I think to myself, do they look like they're in trouble? Should I offer? I don't know if they need help or not. And I've said, excuse me, do you need a hand? And they say, actually, no, I'm good. And I've seen that on a lot of blogs of people living with disabilities. Don't assume what we can and can't do. Ask us.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to get it wrong.
Sometimes you can ask in advance, and sometimes you can ask for feedback.
For sure.
If you've done something and then you're unsure, no one's going to get upset with you if you go back and be like, well, was this the right thing? Do you have any advice for me? Asking for advice.
So as a psychiatrist and as a long-term friend of this friend, you know, every time we go out, I say to her, how do you want me to guide you today? What do you want to do? Do you want to hold the buggy? Do you want to hold my hand? How do you want to do this today? What's going on for you? Some days she might be feeling more confident. Some days she might be having a good vision day. Sometimes it might be really bad. And actually, so, you know what, actually, can we just have coffee at home? Because things change on a daily basis. And it's important for us to step out of our comfort zones. Both sides. You know, we have to empower people with disability to be able to step out and try things and hopefully kind of celebrate the wins, but actually be there if things don't quite go to plan.
Yeah.
And we ourselves as well have to step out of our comfort zones and go, well, what does this invoke for me? Because for a lot of people, and particularly in my line of work, it's, I can't fix this. This is lifelong. This might get worse. What are the implications in the future? Am I going to have to look after you? Am I going to have to care for you full time? How do we answer those questions? And how do we sit with that uncomfortable feeling without reflecting and understanding each other?
I can see that being, you know, the thought process for a psychiatrist, but I'm just thinking of, for myself, probably I would just be thinking, I don't want to upset them. I don't want to offend them. And I don't think that's enough of an excuse, or an excuse enough to stop you from doing the right thing, or to stop you from going the extra mile in educating yourself, in being more helpful, in being more accommodating. So I've really enjoyed this conversation so far. Actually, I feel like I'm learning a lot, even on an individual level.
The thing is I don't think I'm saying anything revolutionary, but in my line of work, my job comes down to a few things. I am experienced in sitting with discomfort. I have sat with patients and felt, this is intense. This feels really uncomfortable. But that's my job, and I do it daily. And so I'm comfortable sitting with discomfort. Yeah? But that comes through exposure. You don't have to go and train for however many years to be a psychiatrist to be able to deal with discomfort. If you examine yourself, why do I feel uncomfortable? Take somebody who's afraid of conflict. Why don't you like conflict? Because it feels uncomfortable. I might get it wrong. I might have to do something. I don't know. That's a normal thought process. Understand why you're afraid of conflict. It will help you understand how to deal with conflict.
But again, this understanding that you're saying, honestly, for me, it goes back to reflection. For me, I just feel like so many times I've had a feeling about something, or I felt anxious about something. And in my head, it makes perfect sense. For example, oh, I'm nervous, I'm hosting a show, you know? And then I need another voice, or my own voice, to be like, okay, what's the worst that can happen? Think about it. And
it sounds like a familiar conversation.
Does this feel like a deja vu to you? It's just that reflection for me is so important, because you're saying that, you know, you're not saying anything revolutionary in your eyes. For many, it will be. And for many, it may not be the first time they hear it, but repetition helps.
For sure.
Right? Sometimes you hear something and in the heat of the moment, you're like, yes, I'm going to do this. Life gets busy. You forget. Sometimes the conversation, you know, the way it's phrased, the way it's worded, the second time you hear it affects you a bit more, and you put more effort. So I think these conversations are very helpful in terms of, you know, being repetitive, but also in terms of, especially today's one, about maybe just shifting the responsibility a bit onto ourselves, accepting more responsibility ourselves for, the society that we live in.
Listen, there's lots of conversations about individualism versus collectivism. We're a very individual society, but Islam teaches us otherwise. And we have a collective responsibility to the people around us. And it doesn't take a lot. As I said, you don't have to be a psychiatrist to spend time with yourself. Spend time on your sajada, spend time on your commute to work. Why do I feel this way? What am I grateful for? What privilege do I have? Like, how many times do we just are grateful for the sun on our cheeks to be able to feel that? Some people can't. Some people, again, I'm fortunate in my job because I'm exposed to so much and it forces me to think. But you can go on blogs, social media, everywhere. You choose those channels that expose you to things that challenge your thinking. In the same way that I might seek out kind of channels online, actually, to be honest, I'm not on social media, but I might seek out things that challenge my understanding of faith and go, actually, have I understood this right? We have to challenge ourselves. We have to be curious. We have to not be afraid of difficult conversations, as long as they're happening in a respectful way. If we purify our intention, what's the harm that can be? I hope I'm right in saying this, because again, I don't speak on anyone but myself, on behalf of anyone but myself. But what's the harm in saying to someone, I'm really sorry if this is offensive, I'm just trying to understand, how can I help you with your cane, or do you need help with your wheelchair? And if they turn around and say, look, I'm having a really bad day, I don't want to talk about this, then fine, that's fine. Respect that. But actually they might tell you something really insightful that you can then go on and use with somebody else in a similar situation.
You just said how there's so many blogs and so many things for you to have access on, and I definitely think one of the biggest, obviously social media has its own downsides, but like everything else, there's the positives and there's the negatives. And I think that we're so blessed to be living at a day and age where information is so easily accessible. And you're saying go and seek it, but if anything, it's actually even easier than that. I was having a conversation with one person once, and we were talking about how it was actually about COVID and how some people were just, in their own bubble because they keep saying, I don't want to hear the news, it depresses me, or I don't want to read the blogs you're talking about because it upsets me and there's nothing I can do. And he actually and we were saying that one of the things that helps us be more aware and helps us be more empathetic and helps us be more grateful by being exposed to others who are living a different life to ourselves is constantly seeing other people's struggles and having this. And one of the suggestions that he gave was, for example, on Instagram, you can follow hashtags. So instead of just following a specific person, so you can follow disability awareness or anything. I feel like
I'm being educated by the youth.
No, I don't mean to do that. I'm here to learn from you. Or inclusion.
We're here to learn from each other.
That's the right attitude. Inclusion. And when you do that, when you're scrolling through social media without even thinking, just killing time, all of a sudden something's going to pop up for you, and it's going to grab your attention. So it's even easier. Like, there is no excuse. It's not even that I don't have time or I don't know what to search. It will pop up for you.
But with that comes responsibility.
Again.
And it's a big responsibility, and sometimes it can feel like a huge burden. So I sit here, I said to you earlier when we were talking, there are people in my team at work who have been in this field for 30 years. Some of them longer than I've been alive. And I, all of a sudden, as the consultant in the team, I'm the expert. No, absolutely not. But it's, I feel like a responsibility to have that expertise, so I have to go out and seek it. But it weighs heavy. And I might get things wrong.
Why do you think some of us are having a harder time than others in accepting this responsibility on ourselves?
I think it's a difficult thing to talk about.
It is, but, just like you said, it's not what Islam teaches us. And we've been raised Islamically and culturally to know this, right? But then when it comes to a practical implication, we don't always apply this to our daily lives.
I mean, you could ask that about anything in Islam, can't you?
Absolutely, right.
There are lots of barriers, and every individual will have their own barriers. And also, let's not forget, there are life experiences too. So in Sister Hawrat Milani's episode, when she was talking about ADHD, she touched on a really important thing about, well, some of these conditions are heritable. That carries with it a lot of guilt. Completely unnecessarily, because it's not in your control. But people might feel... I was speaking to somebody whose child was premature. And she said to me, I don't know what I did. Maybe I did something wrong. And I thought to myself, you're a doctor. You know you did nothing wrong in this. But the responsibility towards our children and the idea of somebody inheriting an illness or a diagnosis from something that I gave them as a mother is a huge thing. So that's one barrier that might stop somebody and might kind of go, do you know what? There's nothing wrong with you. Everything's fine. And they normalize it without empowering that child to understand what their disability is, or what their abilities are, to be able to then go on and achieve the things that they can achieve. And primarily, I hope that can be happiness and contentment more than anything.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's going to go back to one of the barrier that you're just speaking about. Again, putting the responsibility on ourselves instead of the people going through something to help this barrier being taken down. I think we're all going to have to work on our empathy, like you touched on from the beginning. And
examine our biases and think about the conversations we're having in our centres. We touched on kind of the fact that there's been a much more in-depth conversation about mental health within our centres. People aren't afraid to talk about it so much. But then there's always this coming back to this thing. I went to a talk once and it was really nice and thoughtful and thought-provoking. And then at the end was, but don't forget Iman, Iman, Iman. And of course, Iman is essential. But for me, as a psychiatrist sitting in the room, it felt so invalidating in terms of everything they'd just said.
Because some people crave that Iman, and they're fighting to be able to...
Take a very simple example of depression. If you have depressive cognitions, depressive thoughts, and part of your thoughts is a pathological guilt, and someone even alludes to the idea that your illness is rooted in something to do with your faith, that's hard. That's a hard thing to hear. I'm trying, but my brain is not letting me. And that we can go into a whole conversation about biology versus psychology and so on and so forth. Not for today, but I think that we have to think more in a more nuanced way about how we bring faith into these conversations. And ultimately, I think it has to be guided by the community. I'm not here to tell you how your experience of disability links to your faith. Again, speaking to one of the things we talked about briefly in the NHS, there's a big push now, rightly so, for co-production. I'm not an expert. I'm a psychiatrist. You're an expert by experience. I want to know your take on how our services run, what we're doing, how we're helping. So in getting this kind of thought process together, I've spoken to everybody I know that lives with a disability in one way or another. And now that I've given you that spiel, I've forgotten what I was going to say.
Until you remember, I'll go back to the conversation about faith and how it's being addressed and how it's being thought about. I think sometimes we're so quick to judge a scenario or a situation in a specific way. A friend of mine was telling me a story about her friend who has ADHD, and the reputation she had within the family is you always pray late. You don't take your prayers seriously. You look at your siblings, they
the joys of comparison.
Exactly. There's always look at your siblings. And then I'm not sure of the details of was this pre-diagnosis or after diagnosis, but the girl's experience herself was actually, in fact, this is something I strive to be that person that you're saying I'm not. It's not because I don't want to be that, but sometimes between the steps of wudu, some thoughts are going to come in, or you're going to get preoccupied with something else, and you're going to struggle to just maintain your focus, or then not getting distracted for that girl, getting distracted for something by the prayer, and then the confusion of the rak'at and the sajda, something she's really, really struggling with, instead of trying to create a supportive environment, trying to ask her, how can I make this easier for you? How can I help? How can I, for me, sometimes my salah is really hard to concentrate on. So imagining, instead of putting ourselves in a position, how can I help you? How can I make this easier for you? Passing on this judgment, which sometimes might be unconsciously, or sometimes it might be not even with your words, just your looks,
for sure.
Which is even worse sometimes, right? Just making this person feel like you're not doing what you're supposed to, without realizing this person's really trying.
And again, right, so completely 100% agree with everything you said, but then we go back to what might the parent be thinking? Well, they might be thinking it's really important for my kid to really understand Salah and the importance of Salah without having the space to understand. It's hard for... I talked about trauma at the very beginning. So many of my patients and their parents have experienced trauma. And our community, of course, through intergenerational trauma and the legacy of what's happened in Iraq over the years. And not just Iraq. Sadly, the story of Iraq is common in so many other places. But we have to give the benefit of the doubt on both sides. So that parent might be wanting to help, and there has to be space for a conversation, whether or not that has to happen in our centres to help parents understand, whether or not we think about how we teach religion in a secular society. There are so many avenues we could go in. But again, the benefit of the doubt and making excuses for our fellow man, and making excuses for our brothers and sisters about it's hard to say to a child, think about why your mom's trying to do this, but a wider conversation about what's going on. Let's not judge, in a bid to not be judgmental and allow people the space to not be judged. We have to also not judge the judger, so to speak. You know, just openness and honesty, and go, oh, that was really hard. Or, you know, that parent might go to their friend and go, I don't know what I'm doing with my kid. Like, how do I get her to pray? And being able to have those thought-provoking conversations. I came back to the thought that I lost earlier.
Yes.
So what I was saying was about co-production and talking to people and surveying people and thinking about people's experiences is many talked about ups and downs and their relationship with God and faith going up and down as well. Like, you know, it's a rational place to go for some people that why do I have to endure this? You know, and people might ask them and people might provoke that in their mind, or they, you know, we talk about kind of faith and prayer and stuff, and we're encouraged to not have any qualms about what we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What about the person who is asked day in, day out for the 35 years or 85, however many years they've been on this earth, for cure or for help? How do they process that? And I know that there are kind of religious narratives around that, and on a good day that person might understand that and might go, do you know what, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a plan for me. There's a reason why I'm going through this. For some, they go, I don't. But then on another day, when they're feeling more energized, they can go back to their sujood, they can go back to their Quran, they can go back to their dua book, and they can actually have faith and pray that, you know what, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just give me the courage and the strength and the skill and everything that I need to get through my day.
Honestly, I think for me personally, I have learned a lot today. And one of, just before I go through the things, has been just what you touched on right now as well, where sometimes we'll see a disability and we'll think it's the same every day, but it's not. You know, your friend, you said she has the good days and the bad days, and their needs are going to vary day in, day out, and that's something that stuck out for me as well, is that it's not a generic disability or ability.
No 2 days are the same.
No 2 days are the same, and that's something that we're going to have to be open with as well. I'm going to go and watch the TED Talks that you said. I'm going to work on myself.
I wish I could get commission
on my reflection, and I'm going to put more time for my social responsibility. I really, really want to thank you for your time today, for sharing your experiences with us, for coming, for having such an open discussion. And I know you're saying you're not an expert, or you're not saying anything revolutionary. That might be, because I think that it's been a very eye-opening conversation, a very necessary one for me, and I hope for everyone watching at home. And thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me. It's honestly a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you.
Speak to God the way Ali bin Abi Talib speaks to his God, with those words. In the beginning of the first sermon of Nahj al-Balagha, he begins by saying, Alhamdulillahi alladhi la yublughu bidhatul qailun. All praise is due to Allah, whose worth cannot be described by speakers. We begin with hamd, with praise. This is our natural